Here in Liverpool, we've received quite a few requests to comment specifically on the Prime Minister's claim that a general election was necessary in order to strengthen the UK's hand in the forthcoming negotiations with the European Union. So this short video will do just that. The Prime Minister's decision to call a snap election on the 8th of June was justified on the basis of several propositions. In particular, we've already been told many times that the 2016 referendum result was clear and that the government's hardline approach to leaving the European Union, as set out in the Brexit white paper of February 2017, is the right one for the UK. Now, according to the Prime Minister, the country is uniting behind the government's plans, but the other parties at Westminster are playing political games in opposing the government, thereby endangering the withdrawal process and damaging the country. And so we positively need a stronger Conservative government in order to improve the UK's negotiating position and protect the national interest. Now, those claims have already, of course, been greeted with a degree of scepticism. Many commentators believe that the Prime Minister has certain ulterior motives for pulling a major U-turn, calling a snap election. But for now, for our purposes, let's take the Prime Minister's claims at face value and instead ask, how convincing are they, even on their own terms? In that regard, there are still plenty of reasons to be sceptical. For example, take the idea that the referendum result was clear and supports the government's plans to dislocate our relations with the single market and the customs union. Well, we know that the Leave victory was in fact only a very narrow one, and there is no evidence really to suggest that even many Leave voters were in favour of such an extreme outcome, not least since many of the leading Leave campaigners explicitly promised that withdrawal from the EU wouldn't also mean leaving the single market and the customs union. Or again, take the idea that the country is coming together behind the Prime Minister and the other parties are merely playing political games at the UK's expense. Well, I keep hearing at events up and down the country that people never feel that we've been so bitterly divided. It's obvious that a very substantial proportion of the population don't support the government's plans, and after all, it is the legitimate role of opposition parties to give voice to legitimate public opposition. But the main argument we should really be focusing on is the idea that the government has a clear plan for our dealing with Europe, and a general election victory would help to deliver it. Well, judged against the legal framework of the negotiations and their progress so far, I'm afraid that matters couldn't be less true. In fact, the government's negotiating plans are already in a state of disarray, through nobody's fault but their own, for consistently refusing to listen to sound advice which simply didn't conform to their own stubborn beliefs. And it's very difficult to see how a greater majority could, in itself, affect the EU's negotiating position. The flaws in the government's plans go really to the very heart of the UK position, and they can't be cured either through any amount of wishful thinking or any claim to broader public support. Let's explain this further. As anyone who's watched our previous videos will know, the government's Brexit plans are plagued by a range of problems. But for present purposes, the really fundamental flaw lies in the really glaring and irreconcilable disjuncture between the UK's demands and the EU's understanding when it comes specifically to the sequencing and timing of the different strands in the complex negotiations to come. Let's recall the UK position as set out in the February white paper. The government wants both the agreement on the mechanics of withdrawal, which will cover immediate issues such as citizens, migrant rights and financial liabilities, and the agreement on an ambitious and far-reaching future relationship with the EU, covering trade, security, defence and so on, all to be concluded within a period of about 18 months, to be followed then by a phased implementation of that new relationship after withdrawal has already taken place. But the EU's clear and consistent position has been that first we need to sort out the mechanics of withdrawal, and then if sufficient progress has been made on those already quite complex and sensitive issues, then we'll start preliminary discussions about the future. But that future relationship can only be progressed after the UK has already left, and it will take a lot longer to conclude. In the meantime, the EU is prepared to consider certain transitional provisions to help ease the shock of withdrawal, but such arrangements would essentially consist in the prolongation of existing EU regulatory frameworks, not the phased implementation of a non-existent deal. To be clear, the EU position hasn't been dreamt up on a whim. It's certainly not designed to punish poor little Britain, In fact, it's the only interpretation which fits with the basic constitutional principles of the EU legal system as laid down in the treaties. And it's something which legal commentators like me have been saying for well over a year now, and it's a point that's been repeatedly made by the major political actors in Europe ever since the referendum result. And indeed, it is the only interpretation which reflects a more realistic, evidence-based understanding of international negotiations. Let's not forget that it's already taken the UK nearly a year just to be in a position to even start talks with the EU, let alone to actually reach multilateral agreements on a whole range of difficult and complex issues. Now, the degree to which the UK's position simply contradicts the EU's understanding, specifically on this issue of the basic sequence and timing of the negotiations, isn't just remarkable, it's actually potentially catastrophic. Because the government's flawed analysis is actually fundamental to its entire negotiating strategy, as set out in the Brexit White Paper. A whole series of key objectives have been calculated on the basis of this really quite flawed error about the nature of the Article 50 negotiations and the prospects for a future framework deal with the EU. Put simply, it's been clear already for a very long time that we will leave the EU without any proper deal on future relations in place. And it's on that absolutely critical basis that the government should have constructed its plans. Instead, at the moment, it has to be said that the UK no longer has a credible negotiating strategy. Similarly, it's been clear already for a long time that we will still be talking to the European Union about our future relations, if indeed we are to have any special relationship at all, regardless of whether a general election is held now, in 2020, or in 2022. Which means that the argument that the Prime Minister needs a strong mandate and needs it fast is also pretty unconvincing. In fact, it feels tantamount to claiming that for so long as the UK is engaged in international negotiations, we should never change the government. For global Britain, which will be engaged in international negotiations till kingdom come, this almost feels like saying that the country needs a one-party state. So let's return to our original question. Was the Prime Minister correct to claim that a general election was necessary in order to strengthen the UK's position in the forthcoming negotiations? Well, from what we've said, it should feel clear that by asking for a stronger majority in the Commons to support its hardline Brexit plans, the government is effectively seeking to convert a narrow and ambiguous referendum result into a clear and unambiguous policy preference. But that policy preference has been built on a deeply flawed premise, and the government is effectively trying to sell the public a plan which has already begun to fall apart at the seams. So no matter what the outcome of the general election, it's not likely to improve the UK's position in the forthcoming negotiations. It would have been far better if the government had had the courage to admit that it had got things wrong, to use this really quite precious window of time to come up with a legally and politically more feasible plan, and to communicate more realistic expectations to the British public, as well as give individuals, businesses and organisations proper warning of the need to prepare for what's coming next. And in doing so, it could have seized the chance to create a more genuine national consensus on the best way forward, even if that meant standing up to the hard right of their own Conservative Party and the tabloid media, none of whom experience should already have taught us before will ever really be satisfied with anything that compromises their own ideological fixations. Now, all of that is pretty bad enough, but we should also conclude by highlighting two further risks that this general election, which has been offered effectively on a false prospectus, might exacerbate further problems here in the UK. First, the Prime Minister now relies on quite a consistent rhetoric, borrowed directly from the likes of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, that seeks to marginalise and demonise any form of dissent or opposition. It's somehow no longer legitimate to question the government. Indeed, to criticise the government is apparently to endanger the national interest. Well, if the government had listened a little more and a little better, it might not have made the fundamental mistakes that it has done. But in any case, I really can't think of anything less British than encouraging some form of political messiah complex that frankly has a dangerous urge to suppress legitimate debate. Secondly, portraying this general election as some sort of proxy plebiscite in which the public should rally to the national interest by endorsing what is in fact an unrealistic and unfeasible strategy will not only serve to reinforce the already well-established tactic of automatically blaming the EU for everything that goes wrong. It's not just that that is seriously misleading, it's not just that it would also undermine our capacity as the electorate to hold our politicians to account for their own choices and failings, but in addition, it's difficult to see how stirring up a nationalist sentiment can possibly improve the UK's negotiating position with the EU. If anything, encouraging such false expectations is likely to reduce even further the government's capacity to reach pragmatic, reasonable compromises that do actually serve the national interest.